Thanks again, everyone, for joining. My name is Maria Crabtree, and I'm going to be here today with Katie King, Director of Strategic Foresight and Engagement. And I am the Senior Manager of Strategic Foresight. We'll also be joined with Rafael Randall, who is a political and organizational development strategist and former Executive Director of Youth United Change for Change, a democratic organization made up of primarily working class, young people from the community of Philadelphia to hold accountable the public education system in that area. We'll be here today talking about liberatory education and how we have talked about it in our most recent forecast, Imagining Liberatory Education Futures. First, let me tell you a little bit about KnowledgeWorks. Since 2005, we've been exploring the future of learning. So we have over 14 years of working in this field. We have a systemic approach in which we look into kind of the broader ecosystem. But really what drives this nonprofit organization is the opportunity to empower every child for success. What we do in the Strategic Foresight team focus more specifically in exploring possibilities that would help us anticipate changes and prepare for a wider range of future possibilities in order to be a little bit more proactive about what we can do and the many ways in that we can shape our futures. In this occasion, as I mentioned before, we're going to be talking about our most recent anchor forecast, Imagining Liberatory Education Futures, which is based around the focal question of to what extent could our public education system be liberatory and unconstrained of system and structures of oppression in 20 years, which is a really big question. So that's why we're trying to have this conversation in a series of webinars. And also in the publication, we kind of broke it down with two critical uncertainties that serve as the foundation for 4 scenarios. Our 2 critical uncertainties were social cohesion and public institutions responsiveness. And they gave us a good framework to explore a set of 4 scenarios that we go in deeper dive in the publication. So feel free to go in and check that out in the link in the chat. But today we're going to be talking about liberatory education, which is one of the core concepts that we talk in this publication and that we believe deserves more attention, and especially with a lens towards the future. Now I'm going to leave you with Katie.
Thanks, Maria, and welcome everyone. So glad to have you here joining us as we look to dive a little bit deeper into this concept around liberatory education. I'm really excited for the conversation. So as Maria said, I want to give a little bit of context about why we're talking about this and kind of how this conversation came to be before we introduce our guests and get into the big part of the conversation, which is really exploring, answering questions, kind of together learning more about this concept of liberatory education. So as Maria said, we started this project really wondering in the future, to what extent might learners be able to be unconstrained by systems and structures of oppression? And we knew we couldn't answer that question alone. So we did a lot of interviews, research. We involved stakeholders who really work on these questions and issues daily in a collaborative process to develop the forecast. And in the course of that process, we really began to understand that while pursuing equity in education is absolutely necessary in the short term, when we think about the long-term future, we need to aim higher. We need to have a different idea of what the system could be. The forecast states that if we seek simply to make our current education systems more equitable, we will be working and putting our efforts towards providing learners with the supports and means to succeed in a system that resists change. And we think that this would be placing undue burden on those learners, especially those who come from historically marginalized yet resilient communities, really asking them to navigate a rigid system that's built on some really harmful assumptions and harmful practices. So that was really our starting point, is what's sort of, as we're looking to the long-term future, what might this look like? What kind of system might we have? And so we turned to the work of people who have been thinking about this already, including our guest, Raphael Randall. And we came up with kind of a starting definition around what would it mean to have liberatory education. So we have a few key points of that definition that we were working with our publication here on the slide. And these first 2 points really come from the work, from Raphael's work, and name that liberatory education would value many ways of knowing and being while preparing students to participate in and shape the current and future economy and civil society. And learning experiences in this kind of system would encourage high levels of agency for both learners and educators. And learning environments and curriculum would be able to adapt easily to be relevant to changing times. The second 2 points come from the work of educator Zaretta Hammond. And she really looks at this from the lens of liberatory education systems using evidence-based educational practices while treating differences and children's experiences outside of school as assets. So this kind of system would help students learn how to learn, in addition to being exposed to and immersed in developmentally appropriate content. So students would lead their own learning, and she really talks about how liberatory education systems would go beyond simply reconsidering how and where teaching and learning happen to examining what knowledge was taught and who created it. So this is a starting point, and this is the starting point for our conversation. We're hoping to dig deeper into this. We're definitely still in a process of learning and exploring these ideas ourselves. And so we thank you for being on that journey with us. And I invite you just at this point in the chat to put out anything that may be coming to mind as you think of this initial definition of liberatory education, what's resonating with you, what's something that stands out. You can also start to think of questions that you may have as we dig into that part of the conversation. But I'll just pause here for a minute and see if anyone has anything they'd like to share in the chat of what's standing out and what's coming to mind. The assets focus, kind of reframing of authentic student-centered learning. And just a note in the chat, your settings may be set to only send things to hosts and panelists at first. If you'd like to put it out to the chat to everyone, just make sure you have that setting.
Eve, I think that's a good question that I would be interested in knowing more about the question itself.
Yeah, it looks like Eve sent something to the hosts and panelists. Is it practical to think that inequality will not exist for some at points in time? I think that's part of the reason that we think about the future is to grapple with questions like that. So we can certainly dig into that more. Human-centered design focused on project-based learning, experiential design. So lots of other models of learning kind of coming up for folks as we start to think about this. Well, I invite you to continue to add your thoughts in the chat, and Maria and I are going to start by posing a few questions to our guest, and but please do add some in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to monitor those and make time for as many of them as we can. But with that, I am glad to welcome our guest, Raphael Randall, who will give us a little bit more context and help deepen all of our learning around these concepts. Welcome, Raphael.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for being here. So we'll start just with the first question that we have is just if you could talk a little bit about your experience leading Youth United for Change and how that relates to this idea of liberatory education.
Yeah, I can do that. And before I do think it's important to just offer maybe a few caveats from my end. So one, I am not an expert. I'm a practitioner that is in a perpetual state of learning. So that informs my ever-evolving kind of understanding of where we're at when we talk about education and things of that nature. Secondly, a lot of the ideas that were encapsulated in that piece were the product of what historically has been described as revolutionary social practice, meaning people coming together, learning new things through the process of struggling for things, and then synthesizing or summarizing that to come up with a new way of kind of understanding the world around them. And they try to do that as objectively as possible. And finally, another thing that informs our thinking that was presented in that piece is also the experiences historically of revolutionary theorists and practitioners, primarily from the third world. And so those are the things that kind of, when you read that piece, are kind of at the foundation. And so to talk a little bit about my experience with Youth United for Change, as was described, YUC is and was an organization that was dedicated to developing young Black and primarily young Black and Brown youth from working class parts of the city that has historically been marginalized both economically and politically, and preparing them to become leaders through the act of waging campaigns in systems that they were currently situated in as youth, which was the public education system. And so, yeah, and another thing, if you want to learn more about YUC's current work, I'm no longer the executive director, feel free to do that. But during this webinar, I'll talk explicitly about my experience. And so the rationale behind the piece really came from a moment of crisis in the local scene here in Philadelphia as it pertains to education. The piece was written specifically in 2017, a few years after the school district had undergone a series of draconian financial cuts. And there was a broad-based movement of people who were upset about that. There were school closings that occurred. And so there was these contradictions that came to the surface immediately, right? So the first was, sloganeering on our side was really heavy at the time. People who saw the importance of public education really pushing a kind of save our schools mantra. But if you talk to working class and poor people in the city in particular, they would tell you that a number of the schools that they attended were not worth saving, right? They were not preparing young Black and Brown youth to engage their creative impulses towards improving the world around them. And instead, they were simply operating as warehouses, I dare I say, daycares. Capital couldn't exploit them at the time by law, right? So they needed somewhere to go while their parents or caregivers went to work or handled other things. So they would go to school, but the schools were not preparing them, right? So there's this contradiction where there are people like myself who recognize the need for protecting public goods like public education, but at the same time, the schools that we currently have were not what we needed to save. And additionally, there was also tension around school funding, both at the local and state levels, right? So much of the arguing fell into two camps, right? Is it a question of equity or is it a question of adequacy, right? and really just like a reform-driven argument over getting money to particular schools and et cetera. However, what was always missing from these arguments from our standpoint at the time was a compelling vision that didn't draw kind of false dichotomies like that, and instead would operate as a clarion call to push for a new way of thinking about education and by extension governance, right? Because we know that educational systems essentially prepare people for their role in maintaining a given economic and political system. And locally at that time, we were engaged heavily in a campaign and a call for what we was describing as community control of schools, and simultaneously expanding, trying to think about how to expand such a call to the statewide level. And by doing that, it became clear to us that we actually needed to crystallize and concretize a guiding vision, which would inform that strategy of both being able to wage struggle both locally and statewide. And so we knew that, reform wouldn't work, that compromise wasn't work, and that we were going to have to take the idea of education beyond the realm of good governance or simply just being a moral issue, right? Like our kids deserve better. And we had to actually make the issue an explicitly political and, dare I say, class struggle oriented issue, right? So no one is neutral in this education fight, and when you looked at the various players, everyone was being guided by different class interests. And we wanted to make that clear for everyone, including poor and working people. And so to do so would require, right, drawing the line in the sand with the vision that specifically challenged a lot of the Fordist assembly line thinking and ways of educating that we currently experience.
Yeah, thank you for offering all that context. It really helps to put the concept into that background of how it came about. Now, something that I'm curious to know about is that you crafted this vision back in 2017, and now we're in 2022. So 5 years later, how has your idea of liberatory education shifted, especially based on all the work that you did with Youth United for Change?
Yeah, that's a big question. um, and there's a lot, I think there's a Rilke poem where he talks about sometimes you have to live the questions in order to actually get to the conclusion. So I think we're still, myself included, still kind of living in the questions that were raised through that work. But I think, in terms of liberatory education, I think the vision is great, but the thing that always comes to mind is like, how do we actually implement this? Because we say we have this thing that we're trying to achieve, and we're recognizing that it's an inherently political thing. Well, how do we do that, right? And so for us, it was clear, one, we have to have a really solid assessment of the objective conditions that we're facing, right? So in our city in particular, we're dealing primarily, I'm going to use a lot of, a number of gross analogies. I love nuance, but we only have so much time, so forgive me. But we were dealing with an educational system that had like bifurcated tracks within it, right? So there were comprehensive neighborhood schools that were pretty much designated daycares or warehousing spaces for poor and working people who were just be prepared to be standard workers, or dare I say, potential inmates, right? And then we have magnet schools, which are designed to prepare select students from those neighborhoods for futures as functionaries or leaders in broader civil society. And on this, you have a backdrop of a city that is still struggling well over the last 70 years with deep entrenched poverty in the wake of deindustrialization, like longstanding reinforcement of white supremacist ideology within civil society, attacks on labor, and the war on drugs, which devastated a lot of the working class Black and brown communities who make up the majority of the city's population. So in some cases, you have communities here where, dare I say, 2 to 3 generations of people are like further, like removed from engagement in the formal economy. And as I mentioned before, the schools, right, when we looked at the conditions, the schools were not in good shape. They were not suitable for doing what we needed to do. So with this in mind, we needed to, if we wanted to develop the level of progressive leadership we were pursuing, we wouldn't be able to depend on the school system to do that. We'd actually have to create new infrastructure outside of that, within the bounds of our organization, that would both prepare people to reintegrate, right, the creative impulses that have been kind of torn asunder by the system, and I can talk about that at some other point, and train them to fight for supports within the school district that would act as pilots of crawl spaces that would begin to kind of lay the groundwork for a new liberatory educational system, right? So for us, there's a quote that we would lean on often from Alexandra Kollontai, which is, all of our strength, all of our hope lies in organization. So the only way to deal with this level of inequality for us is actually to cultivate an organization, and in particular, a people-powered political organization that would basically do the work that the current system refuses to do for our respective communities. And this is going to continue to be a problem. It's going to grow worse over time because civil society, as we're experiencing it, has grown increasingly unresponsive as liberal democracy has outlived its usefulness due to shifts in global political economy, which requires now a new set of social relations or a new way of keeping the system going. So we are going to have to think about an inside-outside strategy where there's both people within bureaucracies and folks on the outside that are working in tandem to transform the nature of these systems, especially the educational system. So again, not to go over, but we were tasked with doing two things, right? To really start doing this, which was we had to really resist attempts to claw back hard-fought working class victories, right? From those on the right, or even some, dare I say, folks who identified as Democrats in our city, who were scrambling to maintain a status quo by using austerity as a means to do so. And we also had to begin preparing poor and working people, especially youth, but putting them in relationship to folks in an intergenerational way to govern society in their interests, right? So all the work that we were doing in our organization was training people in ways that someone who was probably in a more wealthier district gets trained, meaning we're preparing you to lead. Here is the rigor, the discipline, the things that you'll need, and the skills that you'll need to cultivate in order to do so, not just to be a good worker at some random firm, but to be able to govern not just 10,000 people, but potentially millions, right, collectively. And so, again, as I said before, how we do this will require both the building of like grassroots movements that have a similar orientation. Again, training people to resist and lead. And these organizations, in order to do that, will have to also, in their efforts, like the internal training, train people to build up the social power necessary to secure victories in their current systems that like bureaucrats are reticent to approve, to expand what's possible in the current system. So, and I'll shut up after this, but one of the adages we also live by is that the new is always embedded in the old, right? So we can't just wipe away the old system, right? Like that's not how history works. But what can we do today that we're unable to do? You know, there's a quote that we also would constantly reference by Paulo Freire, is like, what can we do today so that tomorrow we can do what we're unable to do today? So when we wage campaigns to set conditions in the school district that create new realities for young people. Then they'll, and their parents, the other stakeholders could potentially, like after experiencing that, go out into the world and help improve other conditions. And it has like a dialectical relationship. So I'll stop there so we can, because I can just go on and on about it, but so much stuff.
Thanks for sharing that. I wonder if you have any examples or stories of kind of what you saw change potentially in the young people you were working with in the systems towards this more liberatory system and society. What are some of the things that you were looking for that show that you were moving in the right direction? Maybe some wins that you experienced that, particularly as it relates to potentially the young people themselves.
Yeah. So I can give you two bookends that are really important. The first is a failure, right? So in my first 6 months, we got notified by the district that two of the small schools that the organization had previously sought to establish over a 10-year campaign were being slated to close only 5 years after they were open. And that was a painful experience because we realized very quickly that if you do not have a populace or a community that is keyed in to an institution like a school, if you do not have young people that value the school in a real way, and then you do not have, to be honest, a set of economic and political interests that see the value in such school or forced and compelled to see the value of such a school, then these things can be clawed back again, like I said, in the interest of maintaining the status quo, saving money, et cetera, right? And so we waged that campaign. It was my first campaign, and we lost badly because we did not have the things that we needed to protect it in terms of community buy-in, in terms of buy-in from educators, in terms of political and economic interest buy-in. We were, we were basically yelling into the void. And that was a really key lesson for me, that in order, again, as I said earlier in the conversation, this is not a good governance conversation. This is not a reform conversation. This is actually a class struggle conversation, because the neighborhood in which I was situated in is a deeply marginalized and poor neighborhood that folks felt like they could just run roughshod over. And so learning from that, it was clear that we had to develop young leaders who could then help us not only develop a vision for what education could be, but show how the educational system is intrinsically tied to the interest of working people who are no longer in schools. You know, parents have direct relationship to schools, but we needed to move beyond just parents. We needed to get everyone to see these institutions as key to reproducing society in a way that actually benefited them. And so lo and behold, a year and a half, almost a year later, there was another call to close another one of the small schools that the organization had fought for. And this time we were prepared, because we had spent a lot of time doing the work I described before, which is training young people who typically aren't trained to be rigorous, who aren't trained to think methodically, to operate with a historical, clear, critical, historical, and political, and even economic understanding of the world. We prepared them. We gave them actual practice. There was door knocking involved. They were collecting direct information from the residents in the neighborhood about the community control framework that they have developed alongside staff. We had done all that. So when the time came, when the district called for another either closing or consolidation of one of the small schools, these young people alongside the staff really went out and helped, alongside with teachers, went out and built the social force necessary to not only highlight, right, the beauties of that school, because it, to be fair, it had a really robust culture, right? It's the kind of culture that we're describing in the piece, where it's, people are committed to one another. There's a lot of expansiveness, et cetera. They didn't really care about the metrics in the way that the school district was. People felt safe, parents felt safe with their children being there. We played a role in helping cohere the social forces necessary to not only beat back the possible closure or consolidation of that school, but to further reinforce that school as a standard for what is currently being described as community schools of Philadelphia. And we secured $1 million in support to do that, right? So it wasn't just a moral call. Young people went directly out there and made it clear to everyone through door knocking, through speaking out, through having meeting after meeting with elected officials and key other folks in the city, that this was an issue that was, it was a class struggle issue, right? You're saying we don't deserve these things, and here we are, we've cultivated this, and we deserve to save it for ourselves. And so that's just one of the examples that immediately comes to mind when I think about the types of the type of educational systems and experiences we could have in this country, but it requires tweaking how we think about education as a whole.
Yeah, in the chat, Andrea highlighted how that relates to social cohesion, one of our critical uncertainties in the forecast, and both Katie and I agree on that. And it just resonated with me also when you mentioned before the people power, because that's where it comes from. But we have a question here in the chat, actually also from Andrea. She says, in building the new infrastructure, how, what other parts of the education ecosystem should be part of this? I'm thinking of mission-aligned ed organizations like parochial schools, independent schools, after-school programs, etc.
That's a good question. And I have a habit of when I don't know something, I say I don't know. So I don't know. I can only speak on what I do know. But what I do know is this. One, if we want things to change, we're going to need a lot of practice and experimentation, right? So that means we're going to need a lot of people to try a lot of new things and resist the status quo all at once, and hope and do so not just haphazardly, but do so in a way that is rigorous and that sets real precedent. And what that would require is, like, when you have an idea of something that you want to see change in your school, instead of just saying we should do this, actually develop a proposal. When we train young people around leadership, our definition of leadership rests on two things, right? One, a leader must be able to develop proposals, and not only develop solid proposals, they must also be able to cohere forces to carry out said proposals. So members would have to do that in our organization, and they understood that the organization had to do that externally with other forces. The second thing is you also have to develop other people who can do the same thing, right? And so we must, again, engage in a lot of practice in experimenting and trying new things, but also, to the second point, when people see you out doing things, they feel encouraged and inspired to try those things as well, right? And so that's the other principle that I want to tie into this, is the principle of observation and participation. A lot of us cannot conceive of other things because there are not enough of us actually taking risks and engaging in actual class struggle, right? To create new knowledge that other people can see. So we need more people taking risks. I work primarily within a public school system. I can't speak to the other forms of education that exist, but I do think that the system that we have overall is a very antiquated Fordist model that does very little to actually cultivate human beings. It really just does its job in turning us into commodities, right? Into widgets that actually help the commodity producing system that only enriches the very few. So just to sum it up, we all need to be experimenting more. No one can sit on the sideline, take risks, but do it in a thoughtful, rigorous way. And also, if you do that and you document your work, as we've done, it encourages other people to follow suit and try things, because that's what we need. We need a lot of people breaking the bounds of what they're, what they think. And it's not that, people just don't come up with ideas. People's thinking is informed by their environment and what they see. So the more people are trying stuff, the more ideas flow, the more other people will try stuff, and then it becomes an exponential experience.
And Raphael, I recall you saying that there is a kind of retrospective or documentation of a lot of the work that that Youth United for Change did, and so that is a resource that that's out there for folks who may be interested. So I don't know if you have anything you want to share about that, or any of the lessons. I know it's a lot, but any of the kind of key lessons about that idea of trying things and learning from them that might be helpful as the folks on this webinar are thinking about their own next steps.
Yeah, I want everybody to know I didn't ask for the plug, but I appreciate the plug. And the org benefits, I don't get anything from it. But we try to practice what we preach, right? And so we realized that we were coming up with something different in terms of our organizing approach, but also just, how organizations can be structured, given that the current US political economy is far different than, I think, the period of time where the civil rights movements and things like that occurred, which is like heavily valorized in our field of work, but that actually needs to be put in its proper historical context in terms of political economy and what's different, right? And so for us, we were like, we need to actually document this thing because it seems to be working given how harsh conditions are in Philly. And so the first book that we wrote was specifically about organizational development and youth organizing, but it can be applied to any other experience that involves human beings trying to figure out how to operate on a growth edge where the path is not obvious in front of you, but you have to engage in practice to move the ball forward, right? So you can't just hope that you get all this perfect indirect information to inform your thinking. You actually have to engage in the process of taking risk, of documenting what you're doing, and then like building on that over and over again. So the book, again, is called Y'all Trying to Win and All. It's specifically about organizational development, and the overarching narrative focuses on the crisis of the organization when it imploded at the beginning of my tenure, and then what we did to rebuild it. And not only rebuild it, but to set a new standard for what youth organizing could be and what organizing should be in the US as it pertains to these types of struggles. But we realized when we talked to people across the country about it, right, and we did a podcast episode on it, and folks as far away as the Netherlands and Ireland are reading the book. But one of the things that kept coming up was like, how are you getting all these disparate types of people together under one line, right? One line of conduct, and getting them to act accordingly. And what was embedded in that is like, how are you dealing with how difficult it is, given how harsh racial capitalism is on our people and how traumatized we are by it? How are you getting these people to believe in something that they cannot see immediately, but they have to keep moving forward to make it real? And so we wrote a second volume, a companion piece that specifically talks about the relationship between organizational development and personal transformation, right? And we key in on the importance of emotional intelligence, training oneself to understand emotions, not just as like, self-care, right? Which is one of the things we were competing against in our sector, but like learning how to manage one's emotions to be able to carry out strategy over the long term, right? And to do so in a way that like builds up your tolerance for precarity, which is a necessary condition of transformation, right? And so as all of us are moving into a period of deep precarity, that the things that we understood about what it meant to be a United Statesian, the things that we understood about what it meant to be in the world are fundamentally changing rapidly day to day. People do need to learn how to manage or how to better cultivate comfort with precarity, because to, to not be flip, but the majority of our ancestors had to live with that. And I think only within the last 100 or so years have we had this deep fascination with comfort and things being stable, that just by the nature of human history just hasn't been the case for most people. And so it's about us getting more in alignment with who we are as a species and what we've been historically as a species, which is always being able to make a way out of no way in a thoughtful way. And that requires a certain type of emotional intelligence to do so. And so those two books, I think, feel free to download them. They're free. If you like print copies of the book, you can go directly to the organization website, reach out to the office manager, Sia Mata. She can help you with that. But the books can be downloaded for free. And yeah, we just hope they're useful.
We have a question here from the chat from Christine. She asked, can you speak more about how your approaches are competing against self-care approaches?
Wow, that's a spicy question. I just kind of threw that out there.
They're listening.
but it's real. And so what I mean, so I want to be clear. I'm a I am someone who I'm not a trainer, but I practice somatics. The majority of the people that I've worked with and have been in the trenches with, we practice somatics, where I also enjoy psychotherapy to navigate past traumas, all those things, right? But I do so with an understanding not to move away from hard things, right? Which was happening in our movement. I mean, explicitly within the social movement sector in the U.S., there was an emerging trend where, because the conditions were getting harsher and there wasn't an obvious solution readily available for people, and because a number of us, right, have been politicized during a really unique period in time where Barack Obama and his coalition were governing, and all it really took during that time, right, not to be flipped, but like I said, I'm going to make some gross statements. All it took that time was some direct action. You could get a lot of things pushed through at varying levels of government. Because a lot of us were politicized during that period, when things got more draconian with the following administration, there was this growing push to focus on healing as a viable strategy for navigating that period, right? And this isn't to say that healing isn't useful. As I said before, the people that I do work with, the people that I respect, we understand the role of healing modalities in helping us navigate traumas that we've gone through as part of history, as part of racial capitalism. We're not saying that's wrong. But what we do think is a problem is when we basically do that in spite of the work that is required, right? And our thing is, we want to better understand our traumas and the things that harm us, so that we have the emotional intelligence when we're in the field, say, for example, and I'm talking with someone and they say something that triggers me from a past experience, I know how to manage my ability to actually engage that person and still bring them in and win them over, right? So I'm not running from the work through seeking out those modalities. I'm actually digging into those modalities so I can be more proficient and effective in my work as a political worker, right? And so that is really the criticism, and you can read about it in depth. But we don't talk from a high perch. We actually talk explicitly about a number of the traumas that we've gone through and how the work itself, in tandem with those other modalities, was truly helpful in helping us transform and become different people in spite of those traumas.
Thanks, Raphael. If anyone has any final questions, you can put them in the chat. I do want to go back to something someone put in the chat earlier, and just thinking, as we're thinking out to kind of the far future and liberatory education and kind of this concept of the possibility of being unconstrained by systems of oppression. How do you kind of reconcile that? The idea of, is it even realistic or possible to be thinking of inequality being not a part of our future? How do you reconcile that with where we see ourselves today? And how does that kind of inform the way that you move towards the future?
That's a really good question. And I've actually been talking about this thing around inequality with other people. I think we have to understand one thing. Inequality is just, it's like inherently baked in to objective reality. What do I mean by that? We're all not the same in the sense that we're never the same age. We're never coming from the same geographies. We don't have the same histories. And all these things inevitably lead to what we would describe as uneven development, right? So that's just a part of the kind of objective reality that we're living. The problem is not, the issue is not, do we get rid of inequality or not? I think objectively, it's always there. The question is, what are we doing in spite of that to ensure that each human being, or dare I say each living creature that exists on the planet, has the capacity to live out its life's full potential, right? And so it's always funny because I'm gonna get a little spicy, but for example, if you actually look at fascists are actually seeking out historically equality, but they do so by rooting out people who don't fit a particular aesthetic, political, or ideological standard, right? People who've been on the other side of the spectrum have actually tried to wrestle with concretely, we know that we all have these differences. How do we ensure that we consider these differences and build a society that encapsulates those differences in its foundations so that they're not, those differences are not things that prohibit individuals from living their life to its fullest potential, right? And so I think that we have to change the way we think about these things. And I'm talking objectively. The political system we currently have has false inequalities. These inequalities do not need to exist. They exist because the current political economy requires it. But if we change the political economy to one that is actually human-centric and focused on human development, we can begin to create spaces where differences, whether they be biological, whether they be geographical, whatever, will no longer impede people's ability to be whole, fully realized human beings. And I think that that is what I'm interested in. Instead of trying to pretend that everybody's the same, right? Let's be clear, we're not, but how do we actually wrestle with that in a way that makes us even more human and not less? Let's not take shortcuts. And so that's how I think about inequality. It's one of those things where, it's why I do political work, right? I'm constantly trying to think about who are the interests that if we address their interests, everyone else's interests get addressed, right? And I don't mean that in some like there's some magical person that sits at all these intersections that if we just do what they need, like everything gets better. But there are things that if we do look at those differences closely and the folks impacted by it, like if we look at this variety of differences and try to work to meet them, I guarantee everybody will benefit from that. versus pretending that inequalities objectively don't or shouldn't exist. I think they're just a matter of nature.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, Raphael. I value it, and it's something that we mentioned when we describe social cohesion, especially in that the high social cohesion. It's because differences can be seen as an asset, really. Like the fact that we are different makes us better. And I think that resonates with what you're saying just now. And unfortunately, we are ready to wrap up this conversation. So thank you, everyone that have been listening for us. This has been really valuable to have you all here, your questions, your comments, Raphael, here with us. We're taking with us an important insight in which from all these experiences that we hear about liberatory education and how it is applies in practice, we can recognize the true value of social cohesion, even when there's low public responsiveness, which are the two critical uncertainties that we explored in the forecast, and how it seems like even with these conditions that might seem harsh, it could be the best context to have liberatory education emerge from it. It's like in its purest form, this people power, this social cohesion that gets that emerge from this context and this situation could be a really moving force going forward into the future. So I think that's an important takeaway for all of us here who are thinking and acting upon change in education systems. So thank you, everyone, again. Thank you, Raphael. Thank you, Katie, and everyone behind cameras who made this webinar possible. We hope to see you again soon. We'll have other webinars later this year, so we'll keep you posted. Let us know if you have any questions or comments before you leave, but otherwise, we're ready to say goodbye. Have a good one.